Grayson didn't care about bruises at first. Men out here wore mistakes on their skin. But when Chantal reached for the heavy cast-iron skillet, and her faded wool sleeve slipped back, exposing 5 finger-shaped purples pressed deep into her forearm, his stomach turned, not with righteous anger, with bone-deep, quiet dread. Grayson Boone was a man built for isolation, standing 6'6" in his stocking feet, with a chest like a rain barrel, and hands that felt more comfortable wrapped around the hickory handle of a felling axe than a coffee tin. He took up too much space indoors. His cabin, perched high on the spine of the Bitterroot Ridge, smelled permanently of wood smoke, damp pine needles, and the sharp tang of rendered bear fat. It was a good smell. It was an empty smell. Then came Chantal. He hadn't wanted to cook, but the winter logging quota had doubled, and he had 3 men working the lower claim, who needed hot meals to keep from freezing from the inside out. Chantal Edwards had answered the notice he tacked up outside the mercantile in town. She was small, wire-thin, with a frayed woolen shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She didn't look at him when she asked for the wages, only at the scuffed toes of his boots. He hired her because her knuckles were scarred from lye soap and hard scrubbing she knew how to work. For the first 3 weeks they existed in a tense, choreographed silence. Grayson would wake before dawn, the floorboards freezing against his soles. By the time he pulled on his canvas trousers, Chantal was already at the stove. The sounds of her routine became the new rhythm of his mornings. The metallic scrape of the ash shovel, the sudden hiss of bacon grease hitting hot iron, the rhythmic thump of a wooden spoon beating sourdough starter against the sides of a ceramic bowl. He liked the food. He hated the intrusion. It happened on a Tuesday. The wind was howling off the northern face, rattling the oiled paper in the window frames. Grayson sat at the rough-hewn table, methodically working saddle soap into cracked leather reins. The smell of the wax mixed with the rich, heavy scent of the venison stew simmering behind him. Chantal was stretching to lift a heavy cast-iron Dutch oven from the upper hook of the stone fireplace. She wasn't tall enough, and the iron was punishingly heavy. She stood on her tiptoes, straining. As she hoisted the pot, the oversized sleeve of her calico dress slipped down past her elbow. Grayson looked up just as the firelight caught her skin. There, stamped against the pale flesh of her forearm, were 4 distinct, dark, purple ovals, with a larger, thumb-shaped bruise on the opposite side. The grip had been vicious enough to break blood vessels deep beneath the skin. The edges of the bruises were blooming into a sickly yellow-green, old enough to have settled, fresh enough to still throb. Chantal gasped quietly as the weight of the pot shifted, her injured arm failing her. The iron slipped. Grayson moved without thinking, his chair scraping violently backward against the floorboards. He caught the handle of the Dutch oven just before it hit the hearth, his massive, calloused hand swallowing hers for a split second. Her skin was freezing cold. She flinched backward as if he had held a branding iron to her neck, pulling her arm flush against her chest and yanking the sleeve down with her opposite hand. "I have it," Grayson said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble. He didn't look at her face. He stared deliberately at the black iron in his grip, setting it gently on the trivet. "Thank you, Mr. Boone," she whispered. Her breath hitched. She backed away toward the larder, putting the wooden work table between them. Grayson nodded once, grabbed his coat off the wall peg, and walked out the door into the biting cold. The wind hit him like a physical blow, smelling of incoming snow and dead pine. He walked out to the woodpile, grabbed his maul, and swung it into a round of dried oak. Crack. The wood split cleanly. He set up another. Crack. He was furious. Not at the man who had left those marks. He was furious at Chantal for bringing them into his house. He was angry at the complication, at the sudden, suffocating weight of responsibility that those bruised fingerprints demanded. Out here, a man survived by minding his own business, by looking at the ground, by keeping his head down and his axe sharp. To acknowledge those marks meant he had to do something about them, and Grayson was terrified of doing something. His whole life, his size, had made him a weapon. He had come up to the mountain to avoid breaking things. He chopped wood until his shoulders ached, and the pile beside the chopping block was waist-high. When he finally went back inside, the stew was ladled into a tin bowl, steaming on the table. Chantal was in her small partitioned room at the back of the cabin. The door was firmly shut. He sat down, picked up his spoon, and ate in silence. The meat was tender, rich with salt and wild onions. It tasted like ash in his mouth. Over the next few days, Grayson watched her. He didn't mean to, but he couldn't stop. He noticed the way she favored her left side when she carried water from the creek. He noticed the flinch, a microscopic tightening of her jaw, whenever the wind slammed the cabin door a little too hard. He noticed the way she positioned herself in corners, always ensuring her back was against a solid wall. He hated how observant he was becoming. It felt like trespassing. Saturdays meant the supply run down to Red Creek. It was a steep, bone-jarring wagon ride down the switchbacks, the iron-rimmed wheels grinding against granite and frozen mud. Chantal sat on the bench beside him, a heavy wool blanket draped over her lap. The space between them on the wooden seat was barely 6 inches, but it felt like a canyon. Red Creek wasn't a town so much as an infection of canvas tents, rough lumber saloons, and mud that clung to boots like mortar. It smelled of horse manure, sour beer, and unwashed bodies. As Grayson guided the draft horses down the main thoroughfare, he felt the familiar, crawling sensation of eyes on him. Men stepped out of the wagon's path. They always did. He pulled the brake outside Edwards's Mercantile. "I need to go to the smithy," Grayson grunted, wrapping the reins around the brake lever. "Get the flour, salt, and coffee. Put it on my ledger." Chantal nodded, her face pale beneath the brim of her bonnet. She climbed down before he could offer a hand. Grayson walked down to the forge, the rhythmic ring of hammer on anvil cutting through the town's noise. He spent 20 minutes arguing with the blacksmith over the temper of a replacement crosscut saw. He paid in silver coins, hoisted the heavy saw over his shoulder, and began the walk back to the Mercantile. The street was crowded. Drunken miners, cattle drovers, and merchants pushed past one another. Through the gaps in the crowd, Grayson caught sight of the Mercantile's wooden awning. Chantal was backed up against the rough clapboard siding of the store. A man was standing too close to her. Grayson stopped walking. He felt the heavy steel of the saw biting into his shoulder. The man was well dressed for Red Creek, a tailored worsted wool suit, a clean bowler hat, and polished boots that somehow avoided the worst of the mud. It was Akiva Shaw, the town's assayer. Shaw held the town's purse strings, evaluating every ounce of gold dust and quartz that came out of the hills. He was a man made of paper and ink, but he wielded them like a shotgun. Shaw had one hand planted on the wall beside Chantal's head, trapping her. He was leaning in, speaking quietly, his mouth inches from her face. Chantal was rigid. Her hands were clutching a sack of flour so tightly her knuckles were dead white. She was looking at the ground, shaking her head in small, jerky movements. Grayson's jaw tightened. "Walk away," his instincts screamed. "It's town business. It's a domestic dispute. You owe her wages. Nothing else." He watched Shaw reach out and grab Chantal's upper arm, right where the bruises were. Chantal's face went chalk white. She dropped the flour. The canvas sack hit the boardwalk with a dull thud, a puff of white dust exploding over Shaw's polished boots. Shaw scowled, his grip tightening. He jerked her forward, his voice rising enough for Grayson to catch the harsh, grating tone, though the words were lost to the street noise. Grayson felt an ugly, twisting knot in his chest. It was cowardice. Plain and simple. He was a giant of a man, capable of snapping Shaw in half like a dry twig, yet he stood there in the mud, paralyzed by the fear of getting involved, of becoming the monster people always assumed he was. He took a step forward. His boots sank into the muck. He didn't want to be a hero. He just wanted the sickening feeling in his gut to stop. Grayson moved through the crowd. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply walked, letting his sheer mass part the sea of people. By the time he reached the wooden steps of the Mercantile, Shaw was hauling Chantal toward the alleyway. Grayson dropped the crosscut saw onto the boardwalk. The loud, metallic clatter echoed sharply under the awning. Shaw stopped and turned, his face flushed with irritation. He looked up, until he met Grayson's eyes. "Let go of my cook," Grayson said. His voice wasn't a roar. It was quiet, flat, and horribly calm. Shaw sneered, though his grip on Chantal's arm loosened fractionally. "Boone, this doesn't concern you. The woman owes me a debt. A substantial one. I'm simply collecting." "She works for me," Grayson said, stepping up onto the boardwalk. The wood groaned under his weight. He didn't posture. He just stood there, smelling the bay rum on Shaw's collar and the sharp, metallic tang of Chantal's terror. "Her late husband borrowed heavily against my establishment," Shaw snapped, trying to regain his authority. "Legally, she is obligated." Grayson didn't wait for the rest of the sentence. He reached out with a hand the size of a dinner plate and clamped it over Shaw's wrist, the one holding Chantal. Grayson didn't squeeze hard. He didn't have to. He just applied a slow, steady pressure, feeling the delicate bones of the assayer's wrist grind slightly under his calluses. Shaw gasped, his fingers springing open instantly. Chantal stumbled back, clutching her arm to her chest, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Grayson let go of Shaw and stepped between them. He turned his back entirely on the assayer, a gesture of profound disrespect. He looked down at Chantal, seeing the tremor in her shoulders. He felt incredibly clumsy. "Pick up the flower, Chantal," Grayson muttered, his voice awkward. "We're losing daylight." Behind him, Shaw rubbed his wrist, his face dark with humiliation and rage. "You're a fool, Boone," the assayer hissed. "You think hiding her on your mountain changes anything? She belongs to the debt. I'll have the sheriff up there by Tuesday." Grayson paused. He slowly turned his head, looking over his shoulder at the smaller man. The cynicism in Grayson's chest gave way to something cold and hard. "Mountain's steep," Grayson said softly. "Accidents happen." He didn't wait for a reply. He picked up his saw, waited for Chantal to gather the ruined flour sack, and walked her back to the wagon. He felt the eyes of the whole street on them, burning into his back. He had just made an enemy of the most powerful man in Red Creek, and for what? Because he couldn't stand the sight of bruised skin. As they sat back on the wagon bench, Grayson released the brake and snapped the reins. The horses lurched forward, pulling them away from the mud and back toward the high timber. They rode in silence for a mile before Chantal spoke. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the grinding wheels. "He'll ruin you." Grayson stared at the rutted road ahead, the cold wind biting at his face. He felt a deep, exhausted regret, but underneath it, a strange, terrifying sense of clarity. "He can try," Grayson rumbled, pulling his collar up against the cold. "Now stop talking. I prefer the quiet." But as he listened to the unsteady rhythm of her breathing beside him, Grayson knew the quiet on his mountain was gone forever. Tuesday crept over the ridge carrying a bitter, biting frost. The temperature plummeted overnight, freezing the mud ruts on the trail into jagged iron ridges. Inside the cabin, the cold seeped through the chinking in the log walls, a persistent ache that settled deep into Grayson's knuckles. He sat near the hearth, mechanically running a whetstone down the edge of his hunting knife. Schlick, schlick. The metallic scrape was the only sound in the room. Chantal stood by the wash basin, wringing out a flour sack towel. Her movements were stiff. The yellow-green bruises on her arm had faded to a sickly mustard color, but the tension in her shoulders remained tightly wound. She hadn't spoken more than 10 words since the wagon ride from Red Creek. Grayson preferred it that way. Words usually meant a preamble to lies or demands, and he had no patience for either. He dragged his thumb across the knife's blade, feeling the invisible bite of the sharpened steel. The crunch of heavy hooves on the frozen crust of snow outside made his hand stop. There were 3 horses. He could tell by the irregular, syncopated rhythm of their footfalls. Grayson didn't look out the window. He slowly slipped the whetstone into his canvas pocket and laid the knife flat on his thigh. Chantal froze. The wet towel dripped onto the floorboards. "Plip, plip. Go to the back room," Grayson said. His voice was barely a rumble, flat and devoid of panic. She didn't argue. She moved with the silent urgency of a flushed quail, disappearing behind the rough timber partition. The latch clicked shut. A heavy fist pounded on the heavy oak door, rattling the iron hinges. "Boone! Open up!" Grayson stood. His joints popped in the cold air. He walked to the door, slid the heavy wooden bolt back, and pulled it open. 3 men stood on his porch, their breath plumed in thick white clouds. The man in front, Hollis wore a buffalo hide coat that smelled strongly of wet fur and stale tobacco. Grayson recognized him. Hollis was a transient enforcer, a man who drifted between mining camps, breaking fingers for whoever had the silver to pay him. Today, it seemed, Shaw was holding the purse. "Cold morning for a ride," Grayson said, filling the doorframe. He didn't invite them in. Hollis smirked, his lips cracking in the dry air. He spat a stream of brown tobacco juice onto the snowy porch. "Assier sent us. Says you got property of his. A widow woman, owing a debt of $200. "She ain't property," Grayson replied slowly. "She's a hired cook. And she's working." "Shaw holds her late husband's paper," Hollis countered, taking a half-step forward. The two men behind him shifted their weight, dropping their hands toward the heavy leather holsters strapped to their thighs. "Legally, she works off the debt in town, in his laundry, or wherever he sees fit. Bring her out, Boone. We ain't riding back empty-handed." Grayson looked at Hollis's boots. They were tracking dirty, half-melted snow onto his clean porch. "I don't have $200. "Then we take the woman," Hollis said, his patience snapping. He lunged forward, trying to push past Grayson's massive shoulder. It was a stupid mistake. Grayson didn't throw a practiced punch. He didn't posture. He simply reacted with the brutal, pragmatic physics of his size. He grabbed the heavy lapels of the buffalo coat, twisted his hips, and hurled Hollis backward off the porch. The enforcer hit the frozen ground with a sickening thud, his breath leaving his lungs in a sharp wheeze. The man to the left cursed and clawed for his revolver. Grayson stepped into him before the gun could clear leather. He drove his elbow upward, catching the man right under the jaw. Teeth clicked together violently. The man's eyes rolled back, and he dropped like a felled pine, his face hitting the porch boards. The third man, younger and frantic, yanked his Colt free and leveled it at Grayson's chest. Grayson froze. The black bore of the pistol was steady. The air tasted metallic and sharp. Fear, cold and sour, bloomed in his stomach. He wasn't bulletproof. He was just a man, flesh and bone, and a .45 caliber slug would tear through him just as easily as anyone else. "Back up," the young man stammered, his finger whitening on the trigger. "Hands up, you big son of a bitch." Grayson slowly raised his empty hands. He took a deliberate step backward into the cabin. The younger man followed him inside, eyes darting nervously around the sparse room. Outside, Hollis was groaning, pulling himself up from the snow. "Where is she?" the gunman demanded, waving the barrel toward the larder. "Don't do this," Grayson said softly. "You pull that trigger in here, you'll deafen yourself, and then I'll kill you." The bluff hung in the air, thick as wood smoke. The gunman swallowed hard. Suddenly, the partition door groaned. Chantal stood there. She wasn't holding a gun. She was holding the heavy cast-iron Dutch oven in both hands, her knuckles white. Before the young man could pivot fully, she swung it. She didn't have the strength to hit him hard, but she had the momentum of surprise. The heavy iron glanced off his shoulder. He yelped, the pistol firing blindly into the floorboards. The gunshot in the enclosed cabin was deafening, a physical pressure that punched Grayson in the eardrums. The acrid smell of burnt powder instantly filled the room. Grayson lunged. He caught the young man by the collar and the belt, lifted him entirely off the floor, and threw him straight through the open doorway. He collided heavily with Hollis, who was just reaching the top step. Both men went tumbling down into the snowy mud. Grayson slammed the door shut and dropped the heavy oak crossbar into place. Silence rushed back in, broken only by the ringing in their ears and the heavy, ragged sound of their own breathing. Outside, there was swearing, the scrambling of boots, and the frantic slapping of reins. Hoofbeats quickly faded down the mountain trail. Grayson leaned against the door. His hands were shaking. A thin line of blood was trickling down his neck, where a flying wood splinter from the floorboard had grazed his ear. He wiped it away, smearing crimson across his calloused thumb. He looked at Chantal. She was sitting on the floor, the Dutch oven resting between her knees. She was staring at the bullet hole in the pine floor, her chest heaving. "You ruined my floor!" Grayson grunted. It was an awkward, stupid thing to say. Chantal let out a short, hysterical sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "You ruined your porch." They sat in the quiet, the sulphurous smell of gun smoke settling over the smell of the morning's chicory. Grayson slid down the door until he was sitting on the floor across from her. His knees ached. His jaw throbbed. He felt old, tired, and deeply cynical about the violent mechanics of the world. The adrenaline drained away, leaving a hollow, aching exhaustion in its wake. Chantal fetched a rag and a bottle of high-proof corn whiskey from the shelf. She knelt beside Grayson, uncorking the bottle with her teeth. "Hold still," she ordered, her voice stripped of its usual timidity. She pressed the whiskey-soaked rag against the splinter wound on his neck. It burned like a lit match. Grayson gritted his teeth, his massive frame tensing, but he didn't pull away. He smelled the sharp alcohol, the lingering gunpowder, and the faint scent of lye soap on her hands. Her fingers were steady now. The frantic terror was gone, replaced by a grim, workmanlike focus. "They'll come back," Chantal said quietly, wiping away the drying blood. "Shaw won't let it go. He can't afford to look weak in Red Creek. Next time, he'll send the sheriff with a lawful writ." Grayson knew she was right. You couldn't punch a piece of paper. You couldn't intimidate a bank ledger. Out here, the law was usually just the will of the man who held the most capital, and Shaw had a stranglehold on the town's economy. Grayson pushed himself up from the floor, waving away the bloody rag. He walked over to his cot in the corner. He dropped to his knees, his joints complaining loudly, and reached underneath. He dragged out a heavy, iron-bound lockbox. He fetched a small brass key from a chain around his neck and popped the lock. The hinges screamed in protest. Chantal watched him from the center of the room. Inside the box were a few silver dollars, a tarnished watch, and a folded piece of heavy parchment. Grayson picked up the parchment. It felt heavy in his hands. It was the deed to the upper timber. Claim 300 acres of prime, uncut Douglas fir. It was his retirement. It was his independence. It was the only reason he didn't have to break his back in Shaw's quartz mines. He walked back to the table and tossed the deed onto the rough wood. It landed with a soft slap. "What is that?" Chantal asked, stepping closer. 300 acres of timber, Grayson said, his voice flat. Worth about $600 to the Red Creek Lumber Company. Maybe more, if Shaw brokers the deal. Chantal looked at the paper, then up at his face. Her eyes widened as she understood. "No, you can't. That's your land. You worked 5 years to buy that claim." "I worked 5 years to be left alone," Grayson corrected, looking out the frost-rimmed window at the falling snow. "Seems I failed. I won't let you pay my husband's debts," she said fiercely, stepping forward. For the first time, she looked him directly in the eye, her chin raised. "I'll go down the mountain. I'll work in the laundry. I'll survive." Grayson turned to look at her. He saw the faded bruises on her arm. He saw the sharp, stubborn line of her jaw. He felt a strange, heavy knot in his chest. Not pity, and not romance, but a profound, begrudging respect. She was tough. Tougher than the men he employed. "You go down there, he'll own you," Grayson said bluntly. "He'll work you until your hands bleed, and when you're used up, he'll add the interest to your tab. You know it. I know it." He tapped a massive finger against the parchment. "I give him this. The debt is settled. Legally. Cleanly. He gets his profit, and he stays off my ridge." "Why?" Chantal demanded, her voice cracking. "Why would you do that for me? You don't even like me in your kitchen." Grayson let out a long, slow breath. He rubbed the back of his neck, right where the whiskey still burned. He didn't have a poetic answer. He didn't have a hero's speech. "Because a man's got to sleep at night," he grumbled, turning his back to her and walking toward his coat on the peg. "And I can't sleep with the noise of you dropping my skillets." It was a clumsy lie, but it was the best he could manage. The next morning, Grayson saddled his draft horse and rode alone down the mountain. The snow was falling heavier now, blanketing the violent scars in the mud outside his cabin. He carried the deed in his breast pocket, close to his heart. It felt like carrying a stone. He didn't speak to Shaw when he walked into the assayer's office. He just slapped the deed onto the polished mahogany desk, demanded the promissory note bearing Chantal's husband's signature, and threw it into the pot-belly stove in the corner. He watched the paper curl, turn brown, and erupt into bright orange flames. Shaw had smiled, a slick, victorious sneer, but Grayson hadn't cared. He just turned and walked back out into the cold. When Grayson returned to the cabin that evening, the snow was knee-deep. The smell of rich, savory stew hit him before he even opened the door. He stepped inside, kicking the snow off his boots. Chantal was at the stove. She didn't flinch when the door slammed. She didn't cower in the corner. She just turned, holding a wooden spoon, and looked at him. "Debt's gone," Grayson muttered, shrugging off his heavy coat. Chantal nodded slowly. She didn't say thank you. She knew words weren't enough to cover the cost of 300 acres. Instead, she reached for a tin bowl, ladled it full of stew, and set it carefully on his side of the table. "Eat," she said softly, "before it gets cold." Grayson sat down. The wood stove crackled, a warm, steady sound against the howling wind outside. They didn't speak. They just shared the quiet, the food, and the heavy, undeniable truth that survival out here cost everything you had. But sometimes it was worth the price. If this gritty tale of survival and quiet defiance kept you on the edge of your seat, give that like button a hard push. Share the story with friends who appreciate a real, raw Western drama where actions speak louder than words. We bring you fresh, unsanitized stories from the frontier every week, so make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell. Drop a comment below telling us what you think Grayson should do next. Thanks for listening.